Hey YouTube, welcome back to our channel. My name is Elena.
And I'm Bjorn.
And this is Vikings React, where we take a look at some of your favorite Viking TV shows and discuss their historical accuracies.
We're wasting no time at all. It's Vikings Season 6 Part 1, Episode 4 Part 2. Let's do it.
No one can question your legitimacy to rule when I place you upon the throne.
So then I will be your puppet ruler.
Then I will be your puppet ruler. Huh?
You forget something?
What?
I'm a god. Descendant of Odin.
And you are not a god. I'll stuff your boneless body in the casket with my wife.
This is their first couples fight.
That was pretty significant. I wanted to just really quickly glance over the puppet ruler thing. As silly as it was, that was legitimate. The Vikings were very well known for installing puppet rulers in their place, basically to control, different territories and things like that. Like with the Great Heathen Army that supposedly Ragnar's sons were in league with, were part of. When they took over all the different districts and settlements and stuff in England, they would install their own puppet kings there, basically. So it was still somebody who is, from that region, a native Saxon, a native Anglo-Saxon, as a leader, basically to represent them, but they were ultimately controlled into the bidding of the Vikings. Mm-hmm. So that was common practice back in the day.
Yeah, I actually wanted to say that same exact thing.
Oh, beat you to it.
They probably didn't mean this in actual historical context, but the line about him being the descendant of Odin, the way that the Norse viewed their gods was very different from the way that the Christians viewed their own god.
Oh, yeah.
The gods were viewed as, as gods to be revered and, to be looked up to, but they were not the infallible deities that Abrahamic religions kind of make their gods out to be, essentially. And one of the schools of thought was that they almost saw their gods as ancestors.
So there's an old story in the mythology where Heimdall, born of 9 mothers, comes to travel the earth, to travel Midgard. And through his interactions with the different people, he actually gives birth to the different classes of man. So, he meets with a thrall, or a poor lady, and he gives birth to the thralls. He meets with a more middle-class lady and gives birth to the bondeman. And then he meets with a very high-up noble lady and he gives birth to the kings, basically. And then Snorri Sturluson also wrote in his massive dissertation, pretty much like one of the main primary resources that we have for the Viking Age. He wrote about the Yngling Saga, which is where he kind of tries to humanize the Norse deities. The theory is that Snorri Sturluson wrote in the 13th century. He was a Christian himself. Iceland and Scandinavia had been Christian for hundreds of years by then. And he's basically reciting their history to get it written down as like a hard basis so that we don't forget it, essentially. But he's trying to fit their old pagan past with their modern Christian ties. So part of what he did was he actually related a lot of the Norse gods and their mythology with the real world, to say that, Odin wasn't necessarily a god, but he was this mythical man. They were people who were so revered during their time that they were, just passed through stories from generation to generation, that they were immortalized and became gods, essentially, in their primitive view, essentially. So he writes about it in this book right here, which is the Heimskringla, which is Snorri's, basically his dissertation, but it's his massive work of the lives of the Norse kings, as we can see right there. But he actually wrote this to gain good favor with the Norwegian kingdom, as was typical for any kind of skald of the time. It was great to kind of get into the kingly court and gain favor with them. So what did he do? But he wrote the whole line of Norwegian kings back to the beginning. But basically what he kind of does is he personifies the Norse deities. The Heimskringla starts with the saga of the Ynglings, or the Ynglinga saga, which relates around this legendary family, the Ynglings. Also, supposedly, the Skjulfings in Beowulf, if you've ever read Beowulf. The Ynglings was like the first ruling class, or the ruling dynasty in Scandinavia, of those ancient line of kings, basically, back to the beginning. And what happened was Freyr, the god Freyr, actually like traveled and lived in Sweden and lived in modern day Uppsala, and that's where the line started, with Freyr himself. Freyr actually means lord, so it was a common name associated with kings and chieftains and things like that was Freyr, so it makes sense in terms of that. But basically he denotes that the whole line of kings basically came from Freyr in Uppsala in Sweden, and that the Norwegian kings came from the Swedish kings, from that Yngling family. Odin, he also says in the same saga, came from an area around the Caucasus, a little bit further southeast. He kind of incorrectly relates Odin to living in kind of the eastern lands, because he kind of makes the connection between Odin living in the eastern lands based off of one of the words they have for the gods, the Asir, the Aesir. So he kind of sees Asa or Aesir as relating to Asia. So he says that Odin came from kind of a more Eastern Asian part, which is just like linguistically not true. But anyway, so that's where the kind of the idea of the gods being people on Earth kind of came from, where he was trying to relate more of their pagan lives to make it more like acceptable and appropriate to say that they were actually these people who were amazingly famous and legendary humans that were then immortalized through storytelling and things like that.
But that's just one school of thought for who these gods were.
The problem with Snorri, and I'm going to base a lot of this off of Dr. Jackson Crawford, who's an amazing scholar of Old Norse everything, basically, is that you really have to take what he says with more than a grain of salt. Because, again, not only was he a Christian writing about his pagan past, but he also lived in the 13th century, which was hundreds of years after the Viking Age. So he's seen nowadays as a contemporary source, but he's still not really a contemporary source. He's just 800 years closer to the age than anything else that we have. So you still have to be very careful with what he says and not to just take it at face value. Mm-hmm. You still have to analyze, you still have to interpret kind of what his motivation was for everything that he wrote about. And you have to question. It's always important to question these things.
Absolutely.
So Snorri is great. But a lot of scholars and historians have different levels of like believability when it comes to Snorri's writings.
And that also kind of goes for even just like any sagas that we're reading, because even in the Icelandic sagas, the different authors, they had family, their ancestors that were involved in these stories that they tried to kind of put into prominence through the sagas, or they had different reasons to kind of write their own meanings into the stories that they're telling.
Absolutely. And even the sagas, you can't take at face value, because some of them have even been proved to be entirely fabricated. I think, again, I'm looking to Jackson Crawford for this, but I believe he was saying that I think the Jomsvikings saga, as well as the Hrafnkell saga in the Icelandic sagas, were fabricated completely, because there's nothing else in those sagas that based on anything historical that we know fundamentally. It's a great example of Norse society and kind of like what they believed in their culture and things like that, but as a historic story, it's just not a thing. It's just not there. And even for a long time, we didn't even know how accurate the actual Icelandic sagas were until we started to discover little things here and there and realize, that's true. No kidding. They actually did make it to Greenland and things like that. Like for the longest time, the Greenlander saga, even though we had it in writing that the Vikings got there, was just a a farce. The Icelanders believed it, and the Scandinavians believed it, but beyond that, there was no real proof until the 1960s when we found Lanza Meadows, the settlement at Lanza Meadows, to show that the Vikings did actually get there. So every year we're kind of learning new and new things that kind of prove the sagas to be a little bit more and more believable. Not so much that I'll believe Skál lifted up a 300-ton rock and threw it a half a mile into the ocean to crush his housemaid because she yelled at him.
It was probably the hundreds telling of that story.
Yeah.
Is what happened there.
Yeah, so I'm never going to really believe that happened. But I'll believe the Vikings sailed to North America, absolutely.
All good points. That is not to say that when he said that he was a descendant of Odin, that's exactly what he meant, because I'm sure that they're extrapolating a little bit here.
Oh, yeah,
and
absolutely.
Totally do not mean this in any historical context whatsoever.
Right.
But it was a good point to kind of catch and talk about, because I feel like this is one of those topics that doesn't get talked about a lot.
Totally.
And it's kind of good to kind of bring it to the forefront.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's kind of cool to see that, like, even back so close to the Viking Ages, 200-300 years just after it kind of all ended, there was still that kind of philosophical discussion about their origins and about religion and the gods and deities and things like that. So it's just cool to see that that's like a recurring element through all history.
Yeah.
It is time for a rebirth. It is time to elect and anoint a king for all Norway. A king who can unite the people. And what better man than you? Your hindsight. What better king to command our poor, war-torn, fractured country?
So is Olaf like a monk? Like I don't get why he's so like not prolific, but like philosophical and like meta, and like I don't know where this is coming from, and like the danglies and like the sitting in the candles with the socks off. Like I'm just surprised not in like sitting in like the lotus position,
I would ask Michael Hurst about that one.
Michael, if you're listening, we need to talk.
Why?
We need answers, Michael.
So we talked about this before, and just for people who are new to the channel, it's always good to reiterate. So who we're seeing here, hello. So who we're seeing here is Olaf Haraldsson, who is the second King Olaf of Norway and Denmark, because the first King Olaf was King of Norway. The one that is in the show here is King Olaf Haraldsson II, King of Norway and Denmark. He was very Christian.
Very Christian,
He
yep.
was sainted after his death, so he's Saint Olaf.
Yeah, he's the patron saint of Norway, Saint Olaf.
So first of all, for him to be heathen at this point doesn't make sense to his character, and it's actually pretty interesting. I'm finding that they made him a heathen while Oleg is a Christian, and that should be flipped. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that both of those characters, or both of those people, I guess they're not characters, but when you're talking about the actual people, they did not exist in the same age.
No.
King Olaf Haraldsson came way later than Prince Oleg.
Yeah.
So that has to do a lot with the disparity. They're just trying to kind of mash them into the same time frame.
Which we're not unfamiliar with. They've done this a lot.
Exactly, since the beginning. Ragnar and Rollo did not exist in the same time frame either, and that was at the very start of the series.
Yeah, not at all.
So the show plays kind of fast and loose with the time frames, and we've kind of come to expect that from them anyways. So these two characters, Olaf and Oleg, existed in different time frames, and we can understand one of them was a Christian, one of them was a heathen, and here they kind of swap them, most likely for story purposes. We'll see exactly what happens with that. But now he's talking about the first king of Norway, and the first king of Norway came way before him, and he's sitting in the same room as him, Harald Finehair. He is the one that is credited with uniting Norway for the first time. He is the one that has the monument built in his honor, Svertifjell, which we saw, and it is glorious.
It was awesome. Yeah.
And I'm actually even more curious than I was watching the last episode to see where this goes, because he is saying that he wants to make Bjorn the king. We know that Harold is going to end up being the king.
Well, we know that, but I don't know if Michael Hurst knows that.
I hope Michael Hurst knows that.
So maybe we'll be pleasantly surprised.
The fact that Harold is in this scene, and the fact that he's sitting right there, and the fact that we keep focusing on him, or the camera keeps focusing on him, makes me it's a very promising sign. As the series is going on, I'm getting more and more interested to see where they're going to lead these characters, what paths they're going to take, and what exactly is going to happen.
Same.
Because we kind of know historically what happens, but I'm kind of curious to see where they're going to lead us into in all of this mess.
Well, historically we know what happens, but I mean, when I stopped watching was when Harold was making his whole campaign against Ragnar and against Kattegat and things like that. So I had assumed that whole history already happened, and apparently
it has not.
Hasn't. So I don't know where Michael Hurst is going to go with this.
Like I said, because he's in this scene right now, and because the camera was focused on him quite a bit during this entire exchange, I think that is a preface for what's going to happen later on in the season.
Let's find out.
So there is more than 3 of them.
Apparently.
And they have weapons.
Terrible.
They're children. Give them a break.
No. How did the bandits get an army?
That is a very good question.
Stop the attack! Get out! Get out! Get out!
Look at me!
I'm not crying, you're crying. That was really sad. But accurate. If that's any takeaway. Well done, Michael Hurst.
Pulling all the heartstrings.
Yeah. Nothing like a child death to do that one to you. Even though we saw 3 of them. That was like George R.R. Martin level. 3 children died in that scene alone.
Yeah.
Wonder what Bjorn's gonna do. Anyways.
He's going to go nuclear, is what he's going to do.
Yeah.
Which is not a Viking term, but that is what he's going to do.
The Viking term would be berserk. Yeah.
The crossbows.
Yeah.
So we first saw the crossbows show up in, I believe, season 3.
I think so.
And they were accompanied by a bird scope.
A raven skull scope.
Yeah. Not a Viking Age product at all.
Nope. Crossbows were first invented supposedly in between the 7th and 5th century BC in Asia. They saw use in Europe, I think in the 1st century BC or something around then, with the Greek and Roman empires, the early ancient Greeks and ancient Romans, up through the 5th century and things like that. We kind of lost references for any kind of crossbow from the 5th to 10th century, and then they emerged again in France, in the mid 10th century, 945, 947, something like that. So they were definitely a thing. What we kind of typically think of modernly as a modern crossbow, not a modern crossbow, but you know what I mean, a medieval crossbow. That wasn't really a thing until the 12th to 13th century when they started using composite bows and steel additions to reinforce them and make it faster firing power, stronger, things like that. However, although they were a thing, undoubtedly a thing in Europe and in world history and things like that, there's no evidence to correlate the use of them during Scandinavian Viking Age warfare or anything like that. I'm still blown away learning that they were used in France in the 10th century. But there's absolutely no reference or nothing to base the argument on that the Vikings had crossbows. So to speak very historically, there's no reason why any Viking should be walking around with a crossbow.
It's very they're just kind of inferring that the Vikings would have had them because they were sort of kind of around
Yeah.
throughout history.
And, like, sure.
It's yeah.
I'm not going to concede the point, but I'm not going to argue too much about it. It'd almost be like one of those reenactorisms, where it's like, oh, well, if they had it, they would have used it kind of thing. Where, like, they interacted with a culture that that had them a bit here and there, and little things like that. So it's not outlandish to think that they wouldn't know what they were, supposedly.
Well, to put it this way, the Siege of Paris has already happened here.
In this?
Yes.
Yes.
So we're already past the 9th century, as we had said. We're kind of in the 10th, 11th century at this point. And they have had contact with other civilizations and other cultures. So it's not an extreme theory to say that they had access to something like this, considering the fact that crossbows do kind of span all of these centuries. Mm-hmm. It is very much creative freedom.
Yeah.
And it is very much an implied thing that they could have had them.
Yeah.
But it's not going off of any historical basis.
There's nothing for that. There's nothing in artwork, in tapestries that we have. There's no historical basis for it. To say that the Vikings had them specifically, I just want to
Right.
solidify that and say it like 12 times in a row.
Yeah, they existed in the age, but the Viking culture did not have them.
Correct.
We can't have you die now.
I want to be free. Do you mean it?
I would just like the chance to overthrow Prince Oleg.
Sorry.
Oh boy.
Yeah, so one of the things about that whole scene is the injuries that he sustained. The ring that he has in his face.
Is it a ring or a hook?
I
think it's like a meat hook.
I think it's a ring, because he has it going all the way through.
I thought it was a meat hook, just like.
Because it showed him it's on the chain.
Anyway,
even though it could seem like a minor enough injury in our age, you could take it out, you could, sanitize it and repair it.
Dump like a whole bunch of Neosporin in that sucker.
Yeah. That was not a thing back in the Viking Age, and actually the line where he says that he's not going to last the winter, he's probably very correct about that.
Yeah.
The way that I've heard it put, I think our Jarl actually put it this way, that made a lot of sense, is think about the first time that you needed antibiotics, and that's when you would have died back in the Viking Age. Because medicine was not what it is now.
Not by a long shot.
You sustain an injury, and if that gets infected, especially sitting in a cell like that, he's not going to last. Not even the winter, probably not the month.
Yeah, so, they had a fair amount of medical know-how and things like that. Just human history speaking, we know that the ancient Egyptians performed brain surgery and things like that. Mm-hmm. And I saw in passing there was some, I want to say Viking Age, I don't remember exactly, it might have been medieval or something like that, where a bone had split in their arm or their leg or something like that, and they actually reset it and helped it heal using a band of copper plating, because the copper wasn't going to rust. And they actually put that and wrapped it around the bone and pinned it to the bone, which would have been excruciating if you were conscious. But there were signs of healing, so the person lived afterwards. All that kind of stuff is cool, but there was absolutely limitations to what we were able to do. Yeah, and so something like with that massive hook, like in the face, or the ring in the face, whatever, even though we might be able to reset bones or relieve pressure and things like that, like infection was just something that you really couldn't help. If something got infected and the skin started to rot, or like if something got into the bloodstream, that's just not something you can do without antibiotics. And they might have had some level of them, but we have no information in terms of that. Yeah, our information in terms of like medicine used in the Viking Age is pretty limited. So yeah, so absolutely, when you said that he wasn't going to survive the winter, that, yeah, 100% no. I might win the bet to overthrow Oleg. We'll see.
What is it? I had a dream. And in my dream I saw a village all ablaze. I saw women dying. A young boy pierced by an arrow, high up in a tree.
Ali wasn't afraid. He died for all of us. So all of us will stay here.
Kings on the earth together here. To let Bjorn Ironside, King of all Norway. I already have.
Okay.
Cool, so a lot happened. I thought it was fine.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot to dig into, a lot to talk about. But,
Yeah.
like, nothing. Well, there were certain things like the tents, you know, that were just completely out of left field.
Yep.
Not accurate at all. But overall, you know, they're still following the storylines. King Olaf, again, he's a Christian. Prince Oleg, heathen. Those two swaps don't make sense. But overall, you know, we can kind of understand why they're making the decisions that they're making for the show's sake.
For sure. Yeah, sure. Why not? Absolutely.
For the story itself.
Yeah, and I don't have any issues with it. Last we were here, I think I said a 4. I'm gonna bump mine up again to a 5 now. Yeah, I'm still disenfranchised with all of the outfitting and everything like that. That's always gonna keep it back, and the style of the houses and the tents and the little things like that. But I don't know if I'm just getting numb to it, or
Or it's the wine.
or if it's improving, or if it's the wine now because we're done with dry January.
It's February.
It's finally February.
So taking in all of the inaccuracies, the accuracies, like you said, there's still a lot of costuming mistakes, but I think we're beating a dead horse at this point talking about those.
Yep.
I would agree. I'd bring up mine to a 5.
Cool.
Just because we are seeing some harking back to the, you know, some points harking back to the Viking Age, and certain things happening in here that do make sense to the Vikings.
Yeah, they're starting to get they're getting a little bit more comfortable with that mood of Viking again, that Viking mentality, I think, of
Exactly.
you know, very honor driven, and kind of that stuff. You know, you saw it with Bjorn when he was talking to Edge, and you saw it at the end when Lagertha was addressing all of the surviving villagers there and stuff like that, like protecting their honored dead who died for them and stuff like that. It was real cool. It was real Norse. It was real Viking. So I'm bumping it up. We'll keep it out of 5 now.
Yeah.
Halfway.
They're halfway there. That's not too bad. Honestly, getting the show up to halfway is actually pretty good for us. I feel like.
Yeah, so far. And it's kind of good. They've been like steadily kind of climbing. They started off pretty low. You can't get any lower than a hot air balloon. But they're making their way back up.
Yeah.
So
they haven't showcased an army of hot air balloons yet, so we're
only halfway through. So we'll see.
Yeah. Thank you so much for watching, guys. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so you can be notified of our future videos, and we will see you in the next one.
It's never not gonna be funny.
No.
Wait, never not gonna not. Wait. It's never not gonna
Not be funny.
not be funny. It's gonna be funny.